Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode in Season 9 of the Equip Project podcast. We've been looking at world religions and cults, and we've woken up this morning, Jim, to a Labour government. There was an election yesterday, and I know on election nights you don't get a lot of sleep, do you? How was last night?
Well, as you know, I love election nights. I make myself a mug of hot chocolate, a slice of Madeira cake, and wait for the exit poll. Now, you and I were pretty busy on WhatsApp until about 11 p.m, and then you faded away. I actually stayed up all night until about 7 a.m. So I got to see Nigel Farage get into Parliament and Liz Truss lose her seat, and lots of other veteran Tory MPs losing their seats. I mean, it was real high political drama, and I loved it. But it has left me in a somewhat sleep-deprived and unshaven state this morning.
Well, to be honest, Jim, at 11 p.m, it wasn't that I went to bed. It was that my phone battery died. After all that scrolling on X and WhatsApping you, my battery died. I did stay up till about 2:30, I must confess. But after that, I'm impressed you made it throughout the whole night. But it was a very, very interesting night. And I can't wait, to be honest, till November to do it all over again with the US elections.
Oh, yes.
Looking forward to that. I'm going to get some Madeira cake, I think, for that election.
Definitely. And we'll charge our phones.
We will. I'll endeavour to do an all-nighter. But Jim, in this episode, we're going to be looking at the religion of Islam. Those of our listeners who've been listening to us for a long time might remember back to Season 1, where we actually did an episode on Islam. And perhaps people are wondering, well, are you just going to be repeating yourselves? What's going to be different about this?
Fortunately, we're not repeating ourselves, because that old episode was designed to equip Christians to respond to the criticisms Muslims direct at Christianity. And if I remember, we made the point that in order to engage effectively with Muslims, Christians need to know their own theology. Okay, we need to understand the core doctrines of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, and the atonement. So, if you like, that episode was Christianity playing defense. In this episode, I want to go a little more on the front foot and critique Islam itself.
And perhaps our listeners might be taking a sharp intake of breath at this point. Our new Prime Minister has promised legislation against Islamophobia. So are we in controversial territory in this episode, Jim?
I don't think so, because all we will be doing is critiquing a set of religious ideas. As Christians, we're called to love our Muslim neighbours, and that is an easy thing to do because the vast majority of them are perfectly decent, kind-hearted, family-oriented human beings. Of course, we don't hate or fear individual people, but we still reserve the right to critique Islamic ideas about reality in the same way that Muslim apologists critique the Christian worldview. The problem with the term Islamophobia is that it conflates ideas and people. The term is sometimes used to portray any critique of Islam as a racist attack. So we want to put it on record here that we distinguish between ideas and people. And that includes the Prophet Muhammad himself. There are some people who throw criticisms at the Prophet's moral character, but we won't be doing anything like that. I would ask any Muslim listeners to remember that Islam is fiercely critical of Christianity. The Quran itself misrepresents us and our beliefs. Islam calls us polytheists. Our most precious belief is Islam's greatest sin. We're called infidels. Every Muslim apologist I've ever heard begins by saying that our scriptures are corrupt. So it would be unfair for a Muslim to object to a courteous, rational critique of their religious ideas, given the fierce criticism they pour out on Christianity.
So we're going to try and be methodical and careful in this conversation, Jim, and that's why this episode is going to be a bit longer than our usual content. One of the challenges we face is that the subject is so broad-ranging, isn't it? It might be good to start by simply laying out the standard Islamic narrative about how their religion came into being. And then we can think about three big contrasts between Islam and Christianity. We'll contrast the two founders by examining the evidence for Muhammad and the evidence for Jesus. Then we'll contrast the way secular academics have handled the origin of each religion. And finally, we'll contrast the manuscripts of the Quran and the Bible.
Well, once we've talked through your three contrasts, I would like to make 5 specific criticisms of Islamic thought. So listeners who like structure can prepare themselves for 3 contrasts and 5 criticisms.
Okay, so let's get going by explaining what's called the standard Islamic origin narrative. It's founded on 3 historical claims: the man called Muhammad, the place called Mecca, and the book called the Quran. According to Islamic orthodoxy, Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 AD and died at Medina in 632 AD. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, the Muslim Empire covered all of Western Arabia.
Interestingly, we don't get much information about Muhammad from the Quran itself. The Quran mentions Jesus 93 times, it mentions Moses 136 times, but the Prophet himself is only mentioned 4 times. So it might seem strange to claim, as Islamic orthodoxy does, that Muhammad models Islam as the paradigm for the world. But the real information on the Prophet comes not from the Quran, but from other records. I hope I'm categorizing these documents correctly when I distinguish between the following terms. The Hadith records the teachings and actions of the Prophet, and the Surah refers to his biography. So the point is that although the Quran speaks highly of the Prophet Muhammad, nearly all we know about his life comes from the Surah and the Hadith.
Let's consider the Quran itself. We're told that it was sent down from heaven only to Muhammad between 610 and 632 AD. Muslims believe it to be the greatest, the only perfectly preserved, and the final revelation for the world. It corrects all previous revelations. According to Islamic orthodoxy, Muhammad passed on his revelation orally, so the written Quran gets completed in the year 652, 20 years after the Prophet's death, during the reign of the Caliph called Uthman. So when we put those claims together, Muhammad is the exemplar of Islam, based on the Surah and the Hadith, and his revelation is recorded in the Quran. It obviously follows that the standard Islamic narrative requires Mecca, Muhammad, and the Quran all to have existed in the early 7th century in central Western Arabia.
The earliest years of Islam are called the golden years of the religion. Those golden years run from the life of the Prophet up to the year 661 AD. It is by that point, 661 AD, that, according to orthodoxy, Islam is fully formed in Western Arabia. After Muhammad's death, a man called Abu Bakr ruled in Medina for only 2 years before dying of natural causes. He was succeeded by a second ruler called Umar, who ruled for 10 years, that's up to 644 AD, before he was assassinated. And it's Umar who was mostly responsible for the empire's expansion. Then the third caliph, the man called Uthman, who you just mentioned, he took over and he had a 12-year reign before he was assassinated. And the final leader of the Golden Age was Ali, who ruled between 656 and 661 before he got killed in battle. By 661 AD, the empire covered all Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, eastern Turkey, and northern Egypt. From that point on, the Muslim world was ruled by 2 big dynasties. The Umayyad dynasty ran from 661 to 750 AD, and during this time the empire expanded into northwest Africa and on into Spain and up to Azerbaijan. And they nearly broke through into France in 732 AD, but were stopped in the Battle of Tours.
Now, we actually came across that battle in our church history series, didn't we, Jim? Listeners will have to go back and listen to that series, right, if you're not familiar.
Yes. It was Gregory of Tours who came up with that great line. A great deal of things keep happening, some of them good, some of them bad.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah,
You loved that line, didn't you?
I do, yeah. I have it on my Facebook profile. Anyway, the Battle of Tours was one of the most significant battles in world history. Because Islam could have taken over Europe at that point if Charles Martel had not defeated the Arabs. And shortly after this defeat, the Umayyads were massacred in Damascus by the next big dynastic family, who then ruled the Muslim world until the 13th century. And that leads eventually to the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I'm acutely conscious that all those dates might well cause some listeners' eyes to glaze over. Mm-hmm. But it's important to see the rise of Islamic religion in its political context. We can only truly understand this religion when we see it as the cultural cement that bound together a brand new empire. Remember that Muhammad lived at that crucial moment in history when the Roman Empire was collapsing and the remnants in the east of the old Persian Empire were also going under. And so suddenly a power vacuum opened up in what today we might call Jordan and Syria and Israel. And these raw sons of Hagar, as they were called, with little more than a skinful of dates hanging off their camels, came striding into the effete tents of the Persians. They pierced the silk cushions with their spears and ripped up the decadent carpets.
Muhammad himself was a military figure as well as a politician and prophet. And in the space of a single decade, he fought 8 major battles, led 18 raids, and planned another 38 military operations, where others were in command but operating under his orders and strategic direction.
That's true, but I still think it's fair to say that the rise of the Saracens, as the Arabs were called, was a response to the power vacuum in world politics in the early 7th century. Many of the soldiers fighting in the early wars had little knowledge of the Muslim faith. But Islam grows in the context of military and political conquest. That's really important to understand. Whatever conclusions we draw from that insight, it is the polar opposite to Christianity's story.
Yeah, because Christianity was a despised and persecuted religion for the first 3 centuries of its life, wasn't it? We didn't see Christian rulers marching into new lands in those early days. Instead, we saw martyrs torn apart by wild animals in the Colosseum. So the rise of Christianity cannot be explained in terms of military conquest. Let's now think about 3 important contrasts between Christianity and Islam. The first one sets the 2 founders side by side. What is the contrasting evidence for Muhammad and Jesus?
As I said earlier, there's hardly any mention of Muhammad in the Quran itself. Nearly all that we know about the Prophet comes from the Sirah, his biography, and the Hadith, which records his teachings. So the Sirah and the Hadith are the equivalent of the Gospels in Christian thought. The Sirah was written by a man called Ibn Ishaq, who died in 765 AD, but we have no direct record of him or his writing at all. All the material comes from a later man called Ibn Hisham, who died in 833 AD. And he says that he took what he liked from Ibn Ishaq and threw away the rest. Remember, that gives us a 200-year gap between the actual life of the Prophet and the first biography of him. But what about the Hadith, the records of the Prophet's teaching? The first contribution comes from a man called al-Bukhari, who died in 870 AD. A further 5 writers contribute to the Hadith, and they're all writing in the 9th and 10th centuries, so that's around 240 years later than Muhammad. These men lived in cities like Basra, Cairo, and Baghdad. None of them lived in Western Arabia. Now contrast that with the biographies that we have of Jesus. Our Lord died in AD 33. The Gospel of Mark was probably written 20 years later. Luke was written around AD 60, so around about 25 years later. And Matthew comes in round about the same time. Even John's Gospel, written in AD 90, is less than 60 years away. And as we have discussed in previous episodes, Ollie, there is real evidence that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. We have also talked about the early Christian creeds and hymns that Paul quotes in his letters, letters written as early as AD 49. And that evidence has led the most critical scholars to agree that the central claims of Christianity, claims about Christ's deity and his resurrection, were proclaimed by Christians within a few years of Jesus' death. So Islam's biographical evidence for the Prophet Muhammad would be equivalent to the Gospels appearing in the 3rd century, written by people who lived hundreds of miles away.
We said earlier that the standard Islamic origin narrative is based on the man, the place, and the book, on Muhammad, Mecca, and the Quran. Recent scholarship has thrown up a lot of doubts about Mecca's place in the original story. According to Islam, Mecca is the oldest city in the world. It was the home of Adam and Eve after they were sent down from paradise. Islamic literature describes it as filled with lush fruit trees, olive groves, grains, and streams. And according to orthodoxy, it was an important trade hub in the ancient Near East. However, secular historians point out that Mecca has always been located in a desert. In the 9th century, an aqueduct had to be built to supply Mecca. Today it takes 27 desalination plants to provide sufficient water. Now the Quran and other Islamic literature is full of descriptions of disputes with Jewish and Christian communities. But given the inhospitable environment, it is very unlikely that such communities existed anywhere near Mecca in the early 7th century.
An Oxford academic called Patricia Crone investigated the trade routes in Arabia in this time period, in the early 7th century, and she could find no mention of a city called Mecca. The sea trade routes of the Red Sea were all on the African side because it had plenty of water sources, but Western Arabia had no seaports, and the land-based trade routes all passed along the Central Plateau. So Dr. Crone did not find a single reference to a Mecca in Arabia in the whole of the 7th century. The first reference to Mecca comes in 741 AD, but it was said to be situated in Turkey. Now, as you can imagine, this research caused a storm within Islamic circles, so much so that Patricia Crone received death threats and had to move to a different university. But it is interesting that most of the geographies mentioned in the Quran itself are all situated hundreds of miles further north. It's also intriguing that the earliest mosques were built to face Jerusalem or Petra, not Mecca. So the standard origin narrative has some difficult questions to answer. I'm just going to give you one example. The Quran explains Egypt's fertile land by saying that it benefited from lots of rain. But Egypt actually gets very little rain. The land is fertile because the Nile floods. Now, in contrast, the Gospel writers give us lots of geographical and cultural details that have been confirmed by archaeology. They knew what roads were uphill and what ones were downhill. Distances and place names are all accurately recorded. Then there are the names given to people. They all fit in with the names that were popular at the exact time the events took place. So even though Islam is a much younger religion than Christianity, it's only 1400 years old, the biographical details of Jesus Christ are much more credible than the biography we have for Muhammad.
The second contrast we can make between Islam and Christianity is how they are treated by academic critics. We've devoted a lot of episodes to this topic, haven't we, Jim? And in our last season, we looked at the battle over the accuracy of the gospel records and the so-called quest for the authentic Jesus. And we found out that the great attack on the origin of Christianity that began about 150 years ago has now been repelled. The Christian scriptures have come through this trial by fire from critical scholars. How then has Islam fared when it's been attacked by secular academics?
I would say that Christianity has come out of its trial in good shape. But Islam is just about to enter that trial. There is a movement called Islamic revisionist history in academia at the moment. And some of the uncertainties over Muhammad's biography and the status of Mecca have led secular academics in the West to put forward a history of early Islam which is very different from the standard Islamic narrative. Now, we need to be really sensitive here because the revisionists' claims are deeply offensive to Muslims, and I want to make it clear we are not taking a position on this proposal. In fact, I feel a measure of empathy with Muslims because Muslims are standing in the place where Christianity stood 150 years ago. It's now the turn of Islamic scholars to give answers to the questions raised by revisionist secular academics. According to the revisionist account, Islam started off as an internecine feud between Trinitarian Christians and other Christian sects which denied the Trinity and the deity of Christ. A great deal of work has been done on coins recovered from the late 7th century. Now, no coin mints have been found in Western Arabia, but many have been found in Syria, Jerusalem, and also Iran. I mentioned earlier the Umayyad Caliphate that came to power after Ali's death in 661. Well, the first caliph of that dynasty initially minted coins with the symbol of a Christian cross on them. It wasn't until 30 years later, in 692, that we have coins minted by the Umayyads which contain strong denunciations of the Trinity and the deity of Christ. When the earliest inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock were examined, I think the Dome of the Rock was completed in 691 from memory, we once again find denunciations of the Trinity and the deity of Christ. You find the same message in stone inscriptions in Yemen. So that all points to a fight over Trinitarianism. But, say the revisionists, there is no evidence that Islam was a distinct religion until 100 years after Muhammad's death. And that leads to their rather shocking thesis that Islam arises over 200 years from an internecine feud between the Trinitarianism of the Byzantine Church and Unitarian Christian sects. Now, that thesis, say the revisionists, fits with the empirical data that the empire was initially an Arab empire and not a Muslim one.
Now, we can imagine just how offensive that theory is to Muslims, and we're not actually taking a position on it, are we, Jim?
No, not at all. The reason it matters is that Islam is going to be bitten by the very people they regard as their allies in the apologetic debates with Christianity. Muslim apologists, in my experience, tend to use old, out-of-date material from atheists who attacked the scriptures at the end of the 19th century. I'm going to give you an example. Muslim apologists are fond of the swoon theory, which suggests that Jesus did not die on the cross, but that he merely fainted and was later revived. They say, of course, that to deny the resurrection. But here's the thing. No one believes the swoon theory anymore. It has been comprehensively debunked. Not even the most critical of scholars believe in it. And yet Muslim apologists use these old arguments that Christian scholars have successfully debunked. Well, be careful, my Muslim friend. Critical scholarship has started to turn on Islam now, and Muslim apologists are going to learn that secular academics are not their allies. Now, I have to be a little blunt here and point out one big difference. When critical scholars were attacking Christianity, it never entered their heads that the articles they wrote would lead to physical danger. But the same cannot be said for academic critics of Islam. I mentioned Patricia Crone earlier, the Oxford scholar who had to go into hiding after publishing a book on Mecca trade routes. But there are other cases like that. I mean, a lot of the revisionist books have had to be published under pseudonyms to protect scholars from being killed, and that's not a rational response.
The last contrast we want to think about is the contrast between the manuscripts of the Quran and the Bible. Muslims nearly always begin their conversations with Christians by telling us that our scriptures are corrupted, but the Quran has been unchanged since the middle of the 7th century. They claim that the version compiled by Uthman in 652 AD is the same as the version standardized in 1924 that nearly all Muslims now use.
Yes, but it turns out that the story of the Quran is a lot more complicated than that. Let's start with Uthman. The reason that a single authorized version came into existence in 652 is because he collected up all the versions that had developed over the previous 20 years and burned them, apart from the one he selected to be the authorized version. And he did that for largely political reasons. The so-called companions of the Prophet had started up a variety of religious schools throughout the Middle East and throughout the empire. And they each had their own variants of the text. And these prophetic schools tended to be critical of the center, critical of the empire's central leadership. So the standardization of the Quranic text was a move to assert the control of the ruling dynasty.
I suppose the big question is, does the 1924 edition of the Quran contain the same 114 surahs of the 652 AD Quran, complete and unchanged?
The story of the Quran's creation is told by al-Bukhari, who died in 870 AD. So he's writing over 200 years after Uthman's work. And that time gap does not, shall we say, inspire confidence. According to al-Bukhari, in the year 652, Uthman sent 5 copies of his standardized version out to 5 cities. But this is where things get tricky. We know from Islamic sources themselves that another Quran with 116 surahs was sent out a few years later to a different city, and a third appears in Baghdad with only 110 surahs. Then another big complicating factor comes into play. Arabic as a language evolved significantly in the 8th century. Lots of new letters were added, and obviously vowels and dots are introduced, giving the language a much richer set of linguistic resources. You know the dots we see in Arabic today? Well, that allowed one word in the primitive script to mean up to 19 different things in the new script. So by the 10th century, there were around about 700 different Qurans in circulation. And so in the year 936, a man called Ibn Mujahid if I've pronounced his name correctly, was commissioned to choose 7 manuscripts, and he chose the 7 from Medina, Mecca, Basra, Damascus, and 3 from Kufa. Now, the men who had constructed those 7 manuscripts mostly died in the mid to late 8th century, so they were not around in Muhammad's days. If we then fast forward to the 15th century, the 7 that had been selected had grown to 30 different versions. Today, in contemporary academia, a recent scholar spent years tracking these 30 versions down from the 15th century. She travelled to Jordan and Yemen and Syria, all over the Middle East and Africa. And she published her findings. She identified over 93,000 differences between those manuscripts and the official 1924 version that Muslims use today. Now, I strongly suspect that many of those differences were trivial, but her work was still so controversial that she had to go into hiding, and in fact she's still in hiding today.
So, are there then big differences between the earliest manuscripts and the 1924 edition?
There's a scholar called Dan Brubaker who has published a book that contains photographs of the earliest manuscripts, and you can see lots of evidence of corrections, sentences being washed out of the parchment and taping over sentences. But from what I could see, most of the corrections were attempts to standardize the text. So my point here is it's not that the 1924 edition of the Quran is very different from the early manuscripts. My point is that the Quran has been standardized using entirely normal political interventions. There's nothing supernatural in the story of the transmission of the Quranic text. Variations arise and are then stamped out by political rulers.
Back in 2015, there was a great deal of excitement over a manuscript that has been dated between 568 and 645 AD. It's currently stored in Birmingham, and this is almost an original autograph of the Quran, according to some Islamic scholars.
Well, the important point here is that the manuscript is only 33 verses long. Okay, it contains the Quranic accounts of stories called the Sleepers of Ephesus. That was a story originally written by a Syrian Christian bishop in 512 AD. It also contains what's called the Proto-Evangelium of James, written in 45 AD, and the Pseudo-Gospel of Matthew, written about 600 AD. So if the Birmingham manuscript tells us anything, it is just how dependent the Quran is on Jewish myths and early Christian writings. There's nothing extraordinary about the Muslim claim about their manuscripts. Islam is only 1400 years old. At the time of Christ's birth, people wrote on papyrus, which is a much more fragile medium than vellum that was commonplace in the 7th century. And more importantly, the Quran was maintained and promoted by a powerful political elite. It was a status symbol in the 8th century for wealthy Muslim families to own a copy of the Quran.
But even though Christianity is 600 years older than Islam, its catalogue of manuscripts is much more impressive. Counting translations, we have 24,000 copies of the New Testament material, 5,000 original Greek documents. But of course, Muslim apologists point out that there are thousands of variations in those manuscripts.
Of course there are. A lot of them are spelling mistakes or changes that reflect the evolution of language, but many of them are more serious differences. The picture that emerges is that Christian manuscripts were not policed by some central political dynasty. So Christian scholars have cheerfully conceded that when manuscripts are copied, there will always be transmission errors. But given the sheer volume of manuscripts, it has been possible to track backwards through the manuscripts to arrive at the authentic source. So we have at least 4 complete copies of the New Testament from the 4th century, written on vellum. But we have all the papyrus manuscripts from before that as a source check. And so we can be sure that the Bible we hold in our hands is the same as the documents from the earliest days of Christianity.
So we've contrasted the evidence for Muhammad and Jesus. Then we've contrasted the state of critical scholarship directed to both religions. And we've just contrasted the manuscript evidence for the Quran and the Bible. So now you want to argue for 5 criticisms of Islam. What's the first one of those, Jim?
Okay, so we're in the second half of this episode. We've done the contrasts. Now we're doing the 5 criticisms. And my first criticism of Islam is that its criticism of the Christian Bible is incoherent. Now, by that I mean that Islam's attack on the Bible as a corrupt manuscript is logically contradictory. Muslim apologists who argue that the Bible is corrupt are actually arguing against the Quran itself. Now, to prove that point, we need to be really methodical here in how we construct the argument. So I have a Quran on the table, Ollie. We're treating it with respect. And I'm going to ask you to read out some verses from it. So we'll start with Surah 1094, and Allah is speaking here.
Okay, so for the sake of time, we've got these references written out here. And let me just read from Surah 1094. If you, O Prophet, are in doubt about these stories that we have revealed to you, then ask those who read the scriptures before you.
Okay, so Allah is telling Muhammad here to overcome any doubts he may have by asking people who read scripture he has already sent down before Muhammad was around. Okay, now let's read Surah 29, verse 46.
Argue not with the people of the book, except in the fairest manner, unless it be those of them that are utterly unjust. Say to them, we believe in what was revealed to us and what was revealed to you.
That's amazing, isn't it? We believe in what was revealed to us and what was revealed to you. So that verse is placing the revelation of the Quran on the same footing as a previous revelation. But what was that revelation? Well, let's now read 66, verse 12.
And Mary, the daughter of Imran, who guarded her chastity, and we breathed into her body of our spirit, and she testified to the truth of the words of her Lord and of his revelations.
Now, the Quran is saying here that Mary, the mother of Jesus, testified to the truth of the Old Testament scriptures. Okay? And the Quran endorses those revelations. But we can go further. Let's now read 5:46.
Then, in the footsteps of the prophets, we sent Jesus, son of Mary, confirming the Torah revealed before him, and we gave him the gospel containing guidance and light, and confirming what was revealed in the Torah, a guide and a lesson to the God-fearing. So let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed in it.
So we now have the Quran endorsing both the Torah and the gospel as divine revelation. We'll move on now to Surah 5, verse 68.
You have nothing to stand on unless you observe the Torah, the gospel, and what has been revealed to you from your Lord.
So you see that the Quran is standing on the Torah and the gospel. Now, what I want to do is select a few verses that all contain the concept of the Quran confirming the Torah and the gospel. Okay, so we'll start with 2, verse 41.
Believe in my revelations, which confirm your scriptures.
And 297.
Say, O Prophet, whoever is an enemy of Gabriel should know that he revealed this Quran to your heart by Allah's will, confirming what came before.
See that? Confirming what came before. And finally, Surah 3, verses 3-4.
He has sent down upon you, O Muhammad, the book in truth, confirming what was before it, and he revealed the Torah and the gospel.
So all those verses talk about how Allah and the Quran confirm the Torah and the gospel. And that's important because the Arabic word that we translate as confirm means that it is pure, true, and incorrupt. Now, for the sake of time, I won't ask you to read out any more verses, but there's a whole series of them that use a really curious phrase. Now, rather than butcher the Arabic, I'll just give the literal translation. And it's this phrase, that which is between your hands. You'll find that curious phrase in Surah 350, Surah 5, verse 46, and Surah 61, verse 6. Islamic scholars like Muhammad Asad, who died recently, all agree that that phrase is talking about a literal book, that which is between your hands. Okay, it's a literal book that's held in someone's hands. And Asad acknowledges that, in fact, Allah is talking about the Bible. Now, he squirrels away from the obvious implication by saying that it means those parts of the Bible that remained intact. But that is not what the Quran says. So here's the point. The Quran repeatedly endorses and confirms the truthful testimony of the Torah and the Gospels. And it clearly refers to people who are sitting in the 7th century reading the Torah and the Gospel as a book held in their hands. Now, this brings us to the logical contradiction. It's indisputable that the Bibles around in the 7th century were identical to the Bibles found in the 4th century codices like the Vaticanus Codex and so forth. They're identical to the Bibles that we hold in our hands today. So why would the Quran confirm a book that Muslim apologists say is corrupt? They can't say that it was corrupted after the 7th century, because the Bibles of the 3rd and 4th century are identical to the ones we have today. So it must have been corrupted beforehand. But that would mean that Allah was endorsing a corrupt book when he spoke with Muhammad in the 7th century. So Islam's assertion that the Bible is corrupt is logically incoherent because the Quran endorses the Torah and the Gospel as they were available in the 7th century.
A second criticism of Islam is concerned with its relationship with history. So it's sometimes said that Islam contradicts history, while Christianity is validated by history. Can you unpack that argument for us, Jim?
Okay, let's start by asking a question about any religion. Okay, perhaps the most compelling argument against any religion is that it is what you might call a post-rationalization of historical events. So some things happen, and then afterwards, a group of clever people weave those events into a religious story. Now, I think that's actually a really powerful argument against any religion. Atheists apply it to Christianity by saying that the Apostle Paul took the life of Jesus Christ and then used his enormous brain to construct what we today call Orthodox Christianity. Now, here's the thing. Unless a religion has an answer to that charge, it's in serious trouble.
So how would Christianity answer that?
Well, Isaiah the prophet gives the main answer. His argument is that God will promise that he will do some things, and then later in history, when those events come true, we can know that we aren't just making up a story after the fact. One of the main purposes of the Old Testament is to act like a socket into which the New Testament plugs. So Isaiah and the other prophets set out the entire structure of the Christian gospel. A divine figure will come quietly into the world. He will live a life of poverty. Then he will die an atoning death that will solve humanity's biggest problems, allowing a global community of the redeemed to enjoy eternity with God. So, centuries later, when Jesus Christ walks onto the stage of history and fulfills all that the prophets said, we can know that Christianity is not a post-rationalization of events.
Islam takes the opposite approach to history. It sets itself up in the 7th century AD and simply denies anything in history which contradicts the Quran.
That's right, and perhaps the most obvious example of this problem relates to the death of Christ. The atheist scholar John Dominic Crossan was head of the Jesus Seminary for many years. Now, you literally could not find a more liberal, critical scholar on the planet. And yet he has said that the death of Jesus Christ by crucifixion is perhaps the best attested fact in ancient history. There isn't a serious scholar in the world today who denies that Jesus dies on the cross round about AD 33. And yet Islam, from a distance of 600 years, simply denies that historical fact. Now, I could give lots of other examples of that approach to history. But I hope, and I say this gently, but I hope we can see the point here. Muslims just flatly deny historical facts whenever it suits them. So they have zero academic credibility when they engage in historical arguments with Christians or atheists. I mean, it's actually impossible to have a rational discussion with someone who holds up a giant trump card which says, God told me, every time they can't answer a question.
The Quran contains what looks to Christians as some obvious mistakes. It confuses Mary, the mother of Jesus, with Miriam, the sister of Moses. It describes Haman from the book of Esther as a servant of the Egyptian pharaoh from Exodus. It proposes that Noah preached against some goddesses who were worshipped in the 7th century AD. But in every case, the Muslim apologist will assert the Quran has it right, and that the earlier records have therefore been corrupted.
That's right. So let's move on now to a third criticism of Islam, and that is that its conception of God is not coherent. Now, forgive me here, Ollie, if we get a bit philosophical here, but the point is important. Islam's monotheism is what we might call austere. Okay, Allah is this solitary, utterly transcendent monad. He is a bare unity. Now, that version of monotheism is so austere that it becomes impossible to know Allah's nature. And since the 9th century, Islamic theologians have struggled to answer this basic question. does Allah have a nature? And at the time, in the 9th century, one party said no. They reduced God's essence to his eternal oneness. But then there was an opposing school who claimed that stripping God of his attributes replaced the God of revelation with this faceless philosophical construct. I almost laughed once. I came across this quote from an Islamic scholar who said, the choice was not a happy one. There was either a bland, faceless philosopher's God stripped of personality, or there was a God of multiple eternal aspects, disconcertingly reminiscent of the three-in-one Godhead of the Christians. Mm-hmm. So, now to understand my point here, let's contrast it with Christianity. Think about the essence of the Christian God as revealed in the Bible. In Christian thought, God has an essential character. God is love. He is the truth. So in Christian thought, God does not just decide to be loving and truthful. He is constrained by his essential character. So, for example, it's impossible for God to lie. Impossible. However, in Islamic thought, Allah decides to be just and loving because he's just pure will. He's merciful only because, and I'm quoting the Quran here, chapter 6, verse 12, he has inscribed for himself the rule of mercy. You see the difference? Because Allah is absolute will, he could well have chosen not to be merciful. There is no nature or essence in God according to which he must act. Now, in case Muslim listeners think I'm misrepresenting them, listen to this quote from Shabir Akhtar, who's a contemporary Islamic scholar. The Quran, unlike the Gospel, never comments on the essence of Allah. Allah is wise or Allah is loving may be pieces of information revealed to us. But in contrast to Christianity, Muslims are not enticed to claims that Allah is love or Allah is wisdom. Only adjectives are attributed to the divine being. The rest remains mysterious. Norman Geisler has written an excellent book on Islam, and at one point he says this: at the heart of the Muslim inability to understand the Trinity is the Neoplatonic concept of oneness. By reducing God to a bare unity, we are left, he says, with a barren unity. But there's an even better quote. I don't often quote Pope Benedict in these podcasts, Ollie, but he brilliantly exposes the problem with the Islamic conception of God. He says this: the unrelated, unrelatable, absolutely one could not be a person. There is no such thing as a person in the categorical singular. This is already apparent, he says, in the words in which the concept of person grew up. The Greek word prosopon means literally look towards, with the prefix pros meaning towards. So, he says, it includes the notion of relatedness as an integral part of itself. Now, that might sound awfully philosophical, but let me put it in simpler terms. The beauty of the doctrine of the Trinity is that at the very heart of reality, there is mutuality, there is relationship. If it were not for this doctrine, Christianity could not say that God is love. And that argument is significant, because a perfect being must be a loving being. Love, after all, is a moral perfection. It's better for a person to be loving rather than unloving. So, according to the philosophical concept of a maximally perfect being, God must have been a perfectly loving being from eternity past. But love involves giving oneself to another. And in Islamic thought, there is no other, just a solitary, barren monad. It therefore follows that Allah cannot be a maximally perfect being, because he does not give himself away, essentially, in love for another.
A fourth criticism of Islam is that its view of forgiveness is naive. To explain this point, we're going to share a story which the Prophet Muhammad told. You can find it in one of the hadiths, and the story goes like this. A man who lived in a certain city had apparently committed 99 murders. Having done so, he set out to see if his repentance could ever be accepted. He came upon a monk and asked him this vital question. The monk said no. So the man killed the monk, taking the total number of murders up to 100. He then approached a scholar who wisely deflected the question by instructing him to ask some wise men who lived in a village some distance away. Unfortunately for the murderer, he died on the way to the village. According to Muhammad, the angels of mercy came from paradise, and the angels of punishment came from hell to claim his soul. The angels of punishment argued that the man had killed 100 human beings and had done no good works. But the angels of mercy argued that he had been on his way to learn about repentance. So Allah decreed that they were to measure the distance that the man had traveled from his home city and compare that distance with the distance he still had to travel to the village. If he was just 1 cubit closer to where he intended to learn about repentance, he would go to paradise. Then Allah intervened and caused the earth to shrink between the man and the village, so that he was found to be 1 cubit closer to the village, and the angels of mercy took him to paradise.
Now, I'm quite sure the Prophet told that with a smile on his face. But that little parable reveals the difference between the Christian and the Islamic understanding of salvation. Because in Muhammad's story, Allah forgives the man of horrendous sin, but he does so without providing any moral basis for that forgiveness. He forgives because he has the power to forgive. But the whole point of the Christian gospel is to demonstrate that forgiveness is not easy for God. He has to reconcile his justice and his love at the same time. I mean, think of the heartache, the bereavement and loss in the 99 families who that murderer robbed of a father, a husband, and a son. Can all that pain be ignored by a deity who simply uses his power to forgive? Now, it's a really interesting story because it also shows that Allah must have an inconsistent response to evil. Sometimes he judges it, other times he lets it slide. The God of the Bible, in contrast, is unyielding in his repudiation of evil. It must be judged. And that's why Christianity places the cross of Christ at the very heart of its theology. Because there we see God take responsibility for all the pain, the senseless hurt, the damage that sin has brought into our lives. Christ bears the punishment for our sin, and that allows God to offer us a principled forgiveness. It is the cross which establishes the moral basis for forgiveness. It explains how a God of love can forgive and still be a God of justice. So Christians have good reason to charge Islam with naivety at this point, because forgiveness cannot simply be a product of God's power. I mean, think about it for a moment. Consider the horrors that occurred in that place called Auschwitz. All that hurt cannot be swept away by the wave of a divine wand, because sin creates a moral debt, and debts have to be paid.
A final criticism that can be made of Islam is that it cannot be reformed. This is perhaps the most controversial point in our conversation, Jim, because we're dealing with Islam's place in the modern world.
Yeah, we are. Now, we need to acknowledge with gratitude that maybe 1,000 years ago, the Islamic world contributed greatly to human flourishing. Islam made huge strides in mathematics and the humanities and even in ethics. But today there is a lot of unease about how Islam will coexist in the sort of pluralistic society found in Europe and the United States. There is a fascinating public intellectual called Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's written a number of books on this subject. She's married to the historian Niall Ferguson. And Ayaan Ali was a Somalian immigrant who claimed political asylum in the Netherlands. And then after 9/11, she abandoned her Muslim faith and became an atheist. She developed a close friendship with Richard Dawkins. Her political and cultural influence generated a huge amount of hostility, so she had to be guarded 24 hours a day by the Dutch police. Now, I'll finish her story in a minute, but it was during that period of her life that she wrote a book called Heretic, and I've just finished reading it. And in that book, she calls for Islam to go through a reformation the way Christianity had done in the days of Luther.
Yeah, so in our church history series, we charted the story of Christianity from the political power of the medieval popes to the modern notion of denominations with separation of church and state. And Luther nailed his 95 thesis to the door of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg. Ayaan Ali suggested 5 theses that summarized her view of an Islamic reformation. The first was to ensure that Muhammad and the Quran could be open to criticism. The second was to give priority to this life rather than the afterlife, because she described extremist Islam as a cult of death. Her third thesis was to tackle Sharia law and make it subservient to civil law. The fourth thesis was to stop the social control Islam exerts over every aspect of a Muslim's life. And the last thesis was to abandon the call to jihad.
Now, that Reformation model that Ayaan Ali advocated is really interesting. When we look at the whole political edifice of medieval Christendom, and then compare it to the later nonconformists and Baptists who made no attempt to exert political control, you can characterize the Christian Reformation as a sort of back to the New Testament movement. Okay, so when you examine Christendom in the light of the New Testament, you see it as this ghastly, profoundly un-Christian thing. Remember, Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would fight." Romans 15 makes the division between church and state crystal clear. The relationship between Christianity and violence is utterly unambiguous. We are forbidden ever to use it to advance the Christian cause. Now, obviously, medieval Christendom forgot all that. So the Christian Reformation succeeded because Christians eventually realized that their political power structures were deeply un-Christian. So they were led back to the authentic New Testament pattern of how to live in a pluralistic society.
So why can't Islam adopt Ayaan Ali's proposal of a reformation then?
Because authentic Islam, unlike authentic Christianity, is at its core about political domination. Islam's original texts are grounded in the idea of a theocracy, a caliphate, with Sharia law and complete political control. Infidels like Jews and Christians were allowed to live within the Muslim empire, but they had to pay a tax for that privilege. And so the great dividing line between believer and infidel is manifest in authentic original Islamic thought in political terms. And that's why I suggest Islam can never be reformed, because it is built from the ground up as a theocracy. Ayaan Hirsi Ali eventually realized that truth. And she realized that all the things she valued in Western democracy didn't come from liberalism, they came from Christianity. And so, to the utter bemusement of her friend Richard Dawkins, Ali converted to faith in Christ. Now, we're nearly done here, Ollie. I'm not going to say much about the relationship between the Quran and violence. I don't want to be disrespectful here. I don't want to start flinging out proof texts from Islamic writings. But it is well known that there are some really troubling verses in the Quran that relate to violence. And the key point is that jihadists know their scriptures very well. So it's absolutely no use to trot out the old line that Islam is a religion of peace every time there is a terrorist atrocity. Or we could think of the persecution of Christians in Muslim countries. Nearly 5,000 killed last year alone. Over 15,000 churches burned to the ground. I don't think it unfair to say that jihadism grows in the ambiguous spaces that exist within Islamic theology. Ayaan Ali hoped that the ambiguity could be flushed away, if at all possible, using credible hermeneutics and rational arguments. Well, perhaps it can, and I wish Islamic scholars well in that urgent task.
Another area where many liberal Muslims would like to see reformation is in terms of Islam's treatment of women. It's an Islamic principle that the testimony of a woman is worth half that of a man. Surah 2:282 says, "Get 2 witnesses out of your own men, and if there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women, such as you agree for witnesses, so that if one of the 2 women errs, the other can remind her." In the Hadith, Muhammad explains why this principle is in place. A woman's witness equals half of that of a man because, he said, of the deficiency of a woman's mind.
Yes, and that has catastrophic consequences when we think of cases of sexual assault, because in those cases, 4 male witnesses are required. According to the New York Times, up to half of Muslim women who report a rape end up being charged with adultery. Surah 4:34 says, "Men are in charge of women because Allah has made the one of them to excel the other, and because they spend of their property for the support of women. So good women are obedient, guarding in secret that which Allah has guarded. As for those from whom you fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart and scourge them." Now, those are difficult words to comprehend. I mean, Western people just cannot understand those YouTube videos which show imams training men how to beat their wives. But it is a terrible reality. There's a 2006 study of Afghan women which showed that 85% of them reported that they had experienced physical, sexual, or psychological violence or forced marriage. More than 50% of Afghan women experienced multiple forms of violence. Now, the treatment of women is an excellent example of why I fear that Islam can never have a reformation. Because all the misogynistic attitudes that we've discussed can be traced right back to the original writings of the religion in the 7th century.
So what then is the solution? Is there a solution?
Well, I think the story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali gives the answer to that question. That's why I introduced it. I watched an interview with her, and she described her conversion to Christianity by distinguishing between submission and surrender. She said that Muslims are called to submit to Allah because it is a religion that is centered on power. But Christians are called to surrender to a God who loves all of us unconditionally. And I thought that was a lovely way to distinguish the two religions. The really encouraging thing is that hundreds of thousands of Muslims are quietly converting to faith in Christ in the Middle East and also in Europe. Now, let me be clear here. I can well understand the disgust that many decent Muslims feel when they look at the decadence of Western society. Well, Christians share that disgust. But the choice isn't between Islam and progressive wokeism. The real choice is between the solitary, barren monad that is Allah and the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Instead of rules and ritual, Christianity offers a relationship with God himself because we can know forgiveness and assurance of heaven because of Christ's atoning death. So my advice to Muslims is to read the Gospels which the Quran itself calls light from heaven, and then see what you make of Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Jim. And if there are any questions that you have off the back of this episode, we'd really encourage you to get in touch with us. Our email is theequipproject@gmail.com.
Because this is such a long episode, Ollie, we will not be doing a pop quiz.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yes.
That's unfortunate.
And because I have been preparing for it, I mean, I have literally, in the drive to church, I have been listening to Radio 1 or the top 40 so to try and work out, to prepare myself for your questions.
You did annoyingly well in that last one, and I'm going to have to come up with some more difficult questions, Jim. So I will get planning on a more challenging.
Well, we'll maybe do it next time.
Quiz,
because this we've run on quite a long time here.
Yeah, no, this has been a long episode, but it's been really helpful. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure people will have questions off the back of it. So if you do, don't hesitate to get in touch with us via Instagram or via our email address, which is theequipproject@gmail.com. We still have 2 or 3 more episodes in this season, don't we, Jim?
Yes, we're going to do Mormonism, and then I think we might discuss Jehovah's Witnesses.
Brilliant. So lots of content still to come. Thank you so much for your support and for listening week after week. And we look forward to seeing you all again next time.